Hi, Misha here, and in my ongoing series looking at Japanese warships, I've been doing the heavy cruisers. And this will be the last episode because these are the last two heavy cruisers ever built for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Tonei class, Tonei, and Chikuma. And these started off, at least in the drawing board stage, as members of the Magami class. However, after the Magamis had been in service briefly, there were some design shortcomings observed. And after 1936, Japan was no longer obligated by the London Naval Treaty to try to limit the tonnage and gun calibers of their cruisers. So, the Tone class evolved. Tonei. In a lot of ways, these were here to correct issues with the Magami. For example, the first ship, Tonei, had a partially riveted and partially welded hull, but by the time of Chikuma, it was pretty much all riveted. Initially, they were going to have 5 triple gun mounts with the 6.1 inch guns. Then it was decided, and that would be 2 in the front and 2 in the back, 3 in the front. Then it was decided to move all the armament forward, leaving the rear open for things like a flight deck for seaplanes. And then, of course, after the change with the Magamis to the 8-inch guns, they would have 4 turrets all in the front, twin turrets, leaving the back open for seaplanes. Now, after the Battle of Midway, of course, the use of aircraft carriers was important, but even before, the thing is, the Japanese carriers really were intended to be transporting and launching fighters and torpedo dive bombers. Reconnaissance, scouting, what have you, that was left to the purview of cruisers. If you notice, so many of the cruisers we've looked at in this series have had float planes, seaplanes. Well, this was kind of the ultimate extension. So yeah, instead of being number 5 and 6 in the Magami class, these were 1 and 2 in their own class. And they were fitted out to carry up to 8 float planes. However, in practice, no more than 6 were ever on board at any one time, and the standard number was actually 5. Now this is a little bit of a shorter cruiser than the Magami. It's about 620 feet long. Because of the extra stuff it has, it's a little bit slower at 35 knots, although that was the speed of the Magami after their refit. And initially it weighed about 11,300 tons, but after fitting out and fully loaded up with all its aircraft stuff, it could top out at 15,200 tons, give or take. So even though it's shorter, it's definitely a heavier design, and again, they had no reason to make it light now that the treaty system is no longer relevant. And both members of the class would be used to cover the Pearl Harbor attack as they were returning. Then they would be used in early raids in 1942, including the raid on Darwin in February. And used to patrol and destroy a few Allied ships here and there throughout March and April. And they would be at the Battle of Midway, although they really wouldn't get up to much. And after that, they would be transferred to the Guadalcanal campaign that July. Tonei would join the fleet in late 1938. Like I said, it would be used early in 1942. and was started to operate around Guadalcanal Theater, but in August 2nd, 1942, she was damaged from bombs from aircraft from USS Saratoga, so of course she had to go back into port for repair. Afterwards, she was used for supply transport in 1943, and then the raid on November 5th at Rabaul that I mentioned for a few of the other cruisers, she was also damaged there. So, and again, had to be repaired. She was already back in service, though, in early 1944. She was at the Philippine Sea, and she survived. That's about the most you can say. She was also at Leyte Gulf. She assisted in the attacking of a couple of escort carriers, even sinking. And again, she would survive, which is more than you can say from a lot of cruisers there, that battle. Afterwards, though, after a couple of final supply missions, she would return to home waters, because by 1945, the Navy was out of petrol. In fact, Tonei was no longer even using her rear deck because they didn't have planes, they didn't have pilots, they didn't have fuel. So they really just kind of started putting all the kind of anti-aircraft guns they could. She was damaged in March again during an air raid. And then finally she was damaged to the point of sinking in shallow water at Kure in July of 1945. She was raised and cut up for salvage for scrap after the war, though. So not a especially long or auspicious career, but it was longer than her sister ship, Chikuma. She joined the fleet in early summer of 1939 and would operate alongside Tonei in 1941 and 42. It's also worth stating that they would upgrade their seaplanes throughout the war, starting off with biplanes and then upgrading to more modern monoplanes. They were mostly Aichis of different types. In October 1942, Chikuma was actually hit with 5 bombs from SBD Dauntlesses, I believe. Anyway, American bombers at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. So she had to be put into port. Like her sister, she was used for transporting aircraft, transporting cargo, petrol, what have you in 1943. She too would be at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and she would survive. But I guess October was her unlucky month because she would not survive Leyte Gulf. She would be hit multiple times and sink without a whole lot of fanfare on October 25th, 1944. And that was it. The Leyte Gulf campaign really took a toll on Japanese ships. Cruisers also, of course, Misha was lost. Not a good day for them. For Americans, a little bit better. Yeah, this thing is neat how these started off as kind of half carrier, half cruiser battleships, whereas the Mogami was transformed into that in 1943. I told you this is still one of my little favorite models. I just think it's neat. And these are very much similar design. They have a slightly different front turret arrangement to the Mogamis. They've kind of gone away from the traditional pyramidal design to get an extra turret in there. Kind of interesting, just different. And like I said, they would get more anti-aircraft guns later in the war, especially once their planes. By the way, they had 2 catapults, and like I said, they could, in theory, operate 8 aircraft, although they never did more than 6. And these weren't fighter aircraft, these were reconnaissance. But they did provide a crucial element to the Japanese fleet, because again, that was kind of the job of cruisers, was to scout, recon, assess damage after raids. They wanted to reserve the hangar deck space on their carriers for things that make things go boom. Although, as it turns out, their carriers like to go boom on their own quite well. But these are just neat models. Very similar. The big difference between the Tonei and the Chikuma here, one's 1942, one is 1944. One has biplanes, one has monoplanes. There's a little bit of difference in their aircraft armament as well. And guys, there you have it. Covered a lot of cruisers here, so I don't know how many folks will watch it, but it was fun. You know, you end up kind of repeating the same battles because he's operated in groups, whereas sometimes battleships would operate either in pairs or solo with their own escorts. Cruisers would operate in flotillas, and so yeah, they would often take part in the same battles. Japan really did have some of the most heavily armed and advanced cruisers by the standards of the 1930s and even into the early 1940s, because they took them more seriously than most anyone else. In fact, the Magamis and the Toneis are the reason that the Americans introduced the Brooklyn class to kind of counter. But in turn, the Japanese kind of based a bit of these on the on some British cruisers, for example, the County class. It all feeds, a good idea gets repeated. And, bad ideas. And their cruisers are actually pretty damn good. Again, the Magamis had some big shortcomings, but part of that was the whole treaty system, and a lot of treaty ships had problems. The thing is, they fixed them. They fixed the Magamis, and the Toneis really showed that they had learned, I guess compared to like the German Kriegsmarine, it's a much more capable navy, because Japan always wanted to have the biggest, the best ships, and they wanted the best trained crews. And early on, you see this, 1941, 1942. It's really into 44 and 45 after so much attrition, and then, of course, the lack of resources, that the quality really drops off. And conversely, the quality of the American Navy really increases. They gain experience. Keep in mind, America had been at peace in 1941, and they were on the defense. Japan instigated the war when they wanted to, and they've been fighting in China for a long time, really on and off since 1923. Then, of course, you have the Shanghai incident in 1932, and then the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1939. So their army units, their pilots, their vessel, their ship crews, they had years of experience. And this is also a good place to test out their hardware and work out kinks where they could. So going in, they had some very capable ships. Well, we've looked at battle cruisers, battleships. We've looked at some carriers. Now we've gone through the cruisers. Who's up for some destroyers next time? After a while, I need a rest after this one. This was a pretty big effort. So I do appreciate it if you could like, share, and subscribe, and just check out my videos. With that, I appreciate you tuning in. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.